bid sat at $598,000, and nobody in the courthouse hallway moved for a full 3 seconds, which felt longer than the entire morning had felt up to that point. The clerk had already read out the parcel map twice, 2 tracts stitched into 240 acres of tiled ground, and 1 narrow shelter belt, all sold together because the lender wanted a clean exit before quarter close. Caldine stood near the back wall in a pressed dealership shirt, arms folded, watching the room like he had watched rooms for 20 years, sorting people by boots and truck keys and the age of paint on their equipment. Bo Sutton was easy to sort if paint was the metric. Faded canvas coat, seed cap gone white at the edges, and a Chevrolet farm truck outside with 312,000 miles on the odometer. The clerk looked over her glasses and asked for the next increment. A hand rose from the left side, not high, just enough for visibility. 612,000. Bo did not look around after he spoke. Cal did. He looked at Trent Holloway from First Prairie Bank, and Trent gave a small face that said exactly what both men were thinking. No malice, just assumption. This would need financing, and financing might take time. The clerk took the number, called once, called twice, then dropped the gavel. Sold, 240 acres, $612,000 to Bo Sutton. That was the public moment everyone remembered. But the tension actually peaked 20 minutes later in the bank lobby, 2 blocks down. The auction terms required full settlement by close of business, with a proof of funds already on file, and proof had only shown that funds existed somewhere. Trent expected Bo to request a bridge note for at least part of the purchase, and maybe ask for 3 to 5 business days. Bo handed over 1 page with routing instructions, a money market account confirmation, and the closing agent wire template already filled in. Trent read it once, then read the reserve balance line a second time because he had not expected $734,000 of liquid reserves sitting under the same name as that old truck. At 3:14 that afternoon, the title company received $612,000 in 1 wire. No split, no overnight hold, no extension request. The clerk stamped the transfer receipt at 3:28, and Cal happened to be in the hallway when the runner pinned the notice to the board. Nobody gave a speech. Bo signed where he was told, nodded to the clerk, and walked back out to the same truck with the same cracked vinyl seat. The correction happened in silence, exactly as arithmetic usually works when everyone has to look at the same line item. To understand why that room changed and why 1 rusted tractor behind 1 barn carried more meaning than a fleet of new machines on credit, the story has to move back to a different auction, 35 years earlier, when Bo was 19 and still believed adults in town generally knew what they were doing. In 1987, the auction stood on frozen ground outside Bo's Uncle Wade Sutton's machine shed. The day had that iron-gray sky common to late winter in that county, and the auctioneer had to raise his voice against wind that kept lifting the bid cards. Wade had borrowed through years when prices seemed to reward expansion, and his notes were manageable until 1 bad sequence stacked on another, 1 weak price year followed by a yield shortfall and a rate adjustment. The debt had not looked reckless when he signed it. The county extension meeting said scale was survival. The dealer said efficiency paid for itself. The bank said his collateral margin was adequate. Every statement was true, right up to the year it stopped being true. Bo watched an auctioneer sell a planter worth far more than its hammer price, because lenders do not wait for good weather, and good weather does not check loan calendars. He watched Wade sign papers on the tailgate of a pickup while neighbors looked at boots and spoke softly about feed costs, weather, anything except what was happening in front of them. On the drive home, Bo made one rule, and the rule was narrow enough to follow under pressure. No consumer debt, ever. No borrowed truck to look established. No borrowed lifestyle to look successful. Borrow only where the land itself could defend the note through cash flow stress, and even that would be approached like crossing thin ice. The rule did not make him feel heroic. It made him feel less afraid of ending up at the wrong end of an auctioneer's chant. 2 years later, he met Martha, who had grown up balancing feed invoices in her father's kitchen and trusted ledgers more than opinions. They married, kept separate notebooks for 6 months, then merged everything into one system that started simple and never changed in principle. Every dollar coming in had a job before it arrived. Every dollar leaving had a category and a reason. They budgeted repairs before breakdowns happened, saved for taxes monthly instead of yearly panic, and treated depreciation as real cost, whether or not cash moved that week. This discipline looked plain from the outside because plain is how discipline often looks while it is working. In 1991, Bo found a 1967 Oliver 1655 at a retirement sale, 15 miles east, straight tin, honest wear, and a price low because the cosmetics were rough and hydraulics already needed attention. He paid $4,800 in cash, drove it home at 20 miles an hour with Martha following in the pickup, and parked it in a lean-to that leaked on the north side. The tractor became his field partner for 18 seasons on the Sutton Place from 1991 through 2008, and every year it ran represented a year they did not owe a dealer payment. The machine never made him look successful. It made him liquid. The early years were a sequence of small decisions that would have been boring if they had not been cumulative. In 1992, they cleared $12,000 after inputs and living costs, and $10,000 went straight into a reserve account, while $2,000 repaired tile on a rented 40. In 1993, hail cut yields, and they still avoided borrowing by postponing a shop roof replacement and doing patchwork themselves for $900. In 1995, a neighbor sold a used grain auger for $1,300, and Bo bought it same day because hiring custom augering was costing him roughly $2,000 each fall. Savings did not arrive in one dramatic event. It arrived in dozens of choices where no one was clapping. By 1998, retained earnings finally lined up with opportunity. A widow on County Road 14 wanted to sell 130 acres contiguous to land Bo had been cash leasing. She asked $149,500 for the parcel, and closing costs added $3,200. Bo and Martha paid $152,700 without a term note, wrote the check from accumulated reserves and grain account balances, and moved from tenant vulnerability to ownership on ground they already understood by fence post and drainage pattern. Ownership changed their risk profile in one specific way. They could now withstand rent spikes that had broken younger operators around them. The next test came in 2003, when two separate cash leases, a 40 and another 40, came up for sale within 5 months of each other because two retiring owners wanted clean exits before year-end. The combined 80 acres were offered at $130,000, plus $3,600 in legal and filing costs. Bo and Martha had $110,000 available, and a short timing gap before harvest settlements posted. So they negotiated a delayed closing schedule tied to crop delivery, not a banknote. The sellers accepted because they trusted settlement dates more than promises. By winter, they held title to all 80 acres, bringing owned ground to 210 acres, which became their original farm base and stayed the core of every decision after. Cal Dean entered the story as the face of conventional confidence. He was good at his job, knowledgeable, fast with numbers, and rarely wrong in ordinary years. In 2006, he visited the Sutton place with a quote for a new front-wheel assist tractor, priced at $146,000. He penciled a 7-year note at 6.1% and showed a payment schedule near $26,000 a year, rounded, assuming projected fuel efficiency, and fewer repair hours would offset part of it. The arithmetic was not dishonest. It was incomplete for Bo's horizon. Bo kept the quote, thanked Cal, and replaced hydraulic hoses on the Oliver over 2 weekends for $640 and a lot of knuckle skin. Cal read that decision as caution bordering on backwardness. Bo read it as optionality. The Oliver ran through 2008, then a hydraulic failure in spring of 2009 made full repair irrational. Rebuilding would have cost close to $9,000 for a machine worth less on paper, and Bo had already purchased another used unit for field work. He parked the Oliver behind the barn and never sold it. Cal joked once that the rusted thing was a monument to stubbornness. Bo kept it as visual proof of his anti-debt horizon, the machine that did paid work and then stopped owing anyone anything. Every year, the Oliver sat there. One more financed machine somewhere else matured, rolled over, refinanced, or failed. The rust line became a kind of clock. The county entered its high confidence era in the early 2010s. Corn had traded high enough for long enough that aggressive expansion looked rational, and people who expanded looked smart in real time. Eli Warren was the clearest example. Eli was capable, hardworking, and genuinely optimistic, the kind of neighbor who pulled your truck out of mud before asking where you needed to be. In 2011, he moved from roughly 340 acres to over 600 by taking on higher cash rents and buying newer equipment to handle wider windows. By 2013, he was farming 760 acres with impressive yields in good years, and he carried debt, like many operators carried debt, as a tool expected to stay useful as long as prices cooperated. Eli's peak principal reached $1,380,000 at 6.25% variable, spread across land, equipment, and operating structures that had different maturities but one shared vulnerability. All of them depended on income staying above a moving threshold. On a 20-year amortization model, $1,380,000 at 6.25% implies roughly $123,000 per year in scheduled debt service, and his actual annual burden ran higher when operating lines and resets were included. In the strong years, he covered it. He paid bills, upgraded logistics, hired seasonal help, and looked exactly like a success story because he was one under those conditions. The tragedy in his arc came from timing, not character. Nora Pike's path looked different on paper and felt similar in pressure. She ran cattle and hay on family ground with a level of pride that kept her from discussing strain even when strain was visible. After a drought cycle and feed cost spike, she expanded storage and herd infrastructure to stabilize operations, and the move made sense while calf prices held. When weather and prices moved the wrong direction together, she entered a lender restructure at a balance of $420,000, fixed at 5.75%. On a 15-year schedule, that balance meant roughly $43,000 per year, rounded before routine operating costs. One bad hay season could erase her margin for 12 months. Two could threaten the homestead itself. Bo and Martha watched these trajectories without commentary because commentary would not alter market prices. They maintained 210 owned acres, cash rented 90 additional acres, and kept lifestyle overhead almost flat while input costs rose around them. Their house stayed the same. The truck stayed the same. Vacation stayed local. Their strategy sounded old-fashioned in coffee shop talk, yet it produced an increasingly modern asset: liquidity that could move fast when others were forced to move slow. From 2014 through 2016, when corn prices slid and two wet springs hit planting windows, the county started refinancing notes that had been written during easier assumptions. This was the beginning of the stress wave, though it did not look like a wave yet. The numbers at the Sutton table showed the difference before the town narrative did. In 2014, liquid reserves sat near $312,000 after taxes and living costs. In 2015, despite weather delays, reserves reached $355,000 by trimming machinery upgrades and forward buying inputs opportunistically. In 2016, with another wet spring and lower commodity prices, they still climbed to $401,000 through expense control and timely grain sales. In 2017, reserves moved to $468,000. In 2018, $521,000. In 2019, $590,000. In 2020, $648,000, even with pandemic logistics disruptions. In 2021, $701,000. By spring 2022, they held $734,000 liquid before auction day. Cal continued to visit during that stretch, always polite, sometimes condescending without realizing it. He would point at Bo's equipment line and mention downtime risk. He would mention tax advantages of financing. He would mention how lenders were eager to place money with operators who showed ambition through new iron. Bo listened, asked for printed quotes, and filed each one in a drawer Martha labeled deferred costs. The folder grew thick enough to bend. Every quote represented a decision they did not make, and every decision they did not make left cash where they could see it. That restraint looked like reluctance to peers who measured progress by cab smell and paint gloss. By late 2018, the stress wave became public. Variable rates adjusted upward. Input costs moved faster than sale prices. Insurance checks arrived slower after the weather events. Eli refinanced part of his stack to gain term, buying time while sacrificing flexibility. Nora signed her restructure to preserve operations and keep creditors from accelerating. Trent Holloway, who had built his reputation on efficient leverage models, spent more time negotiating extensions than underwriting growth. None of these people were fools. They were working inside a system that rewards speed in good years and punishes fixed obligations in bad ones. Bo's setup looked slow across the boom and looked stable across the squeeze, which is the same trade-off viewed from two time horizons. Eli's turning point came in 2019 when one leased block was lost and his scale equation broke. He had built logistics for 700-plus acres, and losing a key piece increased per-acre burden on what remained. That single loss forced machinery utilization down while debt service stayed up. He sold one combine to reduce payments, then had to hire custom harvest on one section, raising variable costs at the exact time margins were thin. In 2020, a price dip pushed him into covenant pressure, and he entered a tougher restructure. By 2021, he had to sell owned ground to satisfy secured positions, watching a lifetime of labor translate into line items managed by people who had never opened a gate in January wind. The county saw the sale and called it failure. Bo saw it and remembered Wade. Nora's crisis remained quieter because pride often keeps crisis private until options are nearly gone. Her homestead mattered to her for reasons beyond equity, family photos in one hallway, her father's branding iron over the back door, and a view from the porch where she could name every shelter belt by the families who planted them. The $420,000 restructure at 5.75% kept lenders at bay temporarily, yet drought conditions and hay costs kept eating on the thin margin. She paid when she could, skipped personal expenses first, postponed medical visits, and avoided conversations that felt like confession. By 2022, she was current on paper and exhausted in reality, one storm away from default risk returning. All of this set the stage for the courthouse sale in 2022, where appearance and ledger finally collided in public. The parcel itself came from a distressed multi-parcel package tied to defaults in the 2009 and 2010 operating note cohort, and the lender insisted on one combined sale to accelerate recovery. That structure limited qualified bidders because many could finance one tract, but not both together within same-day settlement rules. Bo had submitted proof of funds in advance with no fanfare. Cal interpreted his presence as curiosity or entertainment. Trent interpreted it as maybe a partial bid with bank support. Neither interpretation survived 3:14 in the afternoon, when the wire confirmation printed. The social correction was immediate and restrained. Nobody apologized because rural pride rarely moves that way. Cal stopped joking about rust as a financial indicator. Trent updated internal assumptions and later admitted to colleagues that liquidity stress tests had been underweighted relative to collateral appraisals during expansion years. Bo drove home, parked, and walked past the Oliver without touching it. Martha had already entered the purchase into the ledger, $612,000 outflow against $734,000 reserves, leaving $122,000 liquid and 240 acres added to ownership. Final owned acreage reached 450. The 90 rented acres they had carried before auction became optional instead of necessary. Land ownership changed Bo's next decisions less than people expected. He did not suddenly replace every machine. He did not upgrade the truck. He did not start giving speeches at coffee shops about discipline. He fixed tile on the new ground, addressed drainage first, and mapped a 3-year soil recovery plan that favored moderate gains over flashy inputs. This practical posture invited a different kind of conversation. People who had dismissed him now asked specific questions, usually in private, usually framed as curiosity about timing. Bo answered narrow questions with narrow answers. Martha answered broader questions with one sentence. The numbers were boring while they accumulated and loud when they were needed. The first major act of generosity came through Eli, and it carried no audience. After selling owned ground, Eli still had skill, work ethic, and a family that wanted to stay in agriculture. Yet he lacked stable acreage to rebuild because cash rents on quality ground had climbed beyond what his reset balance sheet could safely handle. Bo offered a cash rent arrangement on 120 acres from the newly acquired parcel, structured with a modest base and flexible adjustment linked to actual yield outcomes. The setup lowered Eli's fixed risk while preserving upside if weather cooperated. This was not charity in the performative sense. It was an economically sane bridge from collapse to continuity. Eli accepted because the terms let him sleep and still respect himself. Nora's assistance required a different tool. Her lender restructure had stabilized the account, yet the annual burden remained too high for the volatility she faced, and default risk kept returning after each rough season. Bo, with counsel, arranged a secured private farm note approach that mirrored intra-family lending structures allowed under state law. He provided funds to retire the pressured bank exposure tied to the 420,000 restructure framework and replaced it with a longer schedule and lower annual burden, recorded lien, legal filings complete, no handshake ambiguity. The practical outcome was simple. Nora kept the homestead and regained breathing room. Her pride and long silence were left intact because nothing about the note required public explanation. Bo kept silent too. County records later showed the lien status change, and people who needed to know could read it there. Generosity expanded one step further in 2024 through education, where Bo and Martha saw leverage of a healthier kind. They established the Sutton Agricultural Ledger Scholarship as a $180,000 endowment with the local foundation administration. Criteria focused on students entering agricultural finance, farm accounting, or rural lending risk analysis. Lena Sutton, their granddaughter, became the first recipient in her cohort as a first-generation agricultural finance student, and the award structure required community internships so knowledge cycled back into the county instead of leaving with diplomas. The scholarship was designed with Martha's fingerprints all over it: annual disbursement limits, principal preservation targets, and reporting requirements clear enough to survive personalities. Money had given them options. Structure would give the gift durability. By summer of 2024, the county recorder office could document a strange sentence that sounded like folklore until you checked filings. In the 2009 and 2010 operating note cohort, every loan had reached an end state: matured, refinanced, charged off, or foreclosed. Every loan was gone in its original form. The rusted Oliver still sat behind the Sutton barn, parked since 2009 after hydraulic failure, unsold, unmoved except for grass trimming around the tires. The title phrase people started repeating, that old Oliver outlasted every loan in the county, was technically shorthand, yet it captured the timeline in one image better than any chart could. Cal Dean's resolution came without humiliation. At a later machinery consignment sale, he stood beside Bo and asked one clean question: how he evaluated replacement timing without defaulting to payment-based thinking. Bo answered with a method: expected downtime cost per season versus purchase cost net of resale, and the threshold where repair risk justified replacement. Cal listened and nodded because professionals can update when evidence arrives in their own county on their own watch. He still sold new equipment. He sold it with different caveats after that. He started asking younger buyers about liquidity buffers before discussing paint options. Public correction had happened at auction. Practical correction happened afterward in his sales process. Trent Holloway's resolution happened in policy language, dry enough that few residents noticed. First Prairie Bank revised underwriting templates to include multi-year stress scenarios with lower commodity prices, delayed planting assumptions, and explicit liquidity minimums relative to operating scale. The old model had weighted collateral and recent earnings heavily. The revised model gave survival weight to cash reserves and debt service ratios that could withstand ugly years. Trent did not become anti-debt. He became less romantic about leverage under weather and price uncertainty. When asked why the shift, he cited county outcomes, not theories. He had watched one cash wire settle in minutes, while larger, leveraged structures spent years unwinding. Eli's resolution carried dignity regained in increments. On the 120 rented acres from Bo, he rebuilt working capital slowly, one season at a time, and stopped trying to win every acreage race. The same operator who had made 760 acres work in the good years now chose durability over speed and that shift came from experience instead of defeat. He reduced machinery complexity, hired custom where it penciled better, and focused on margin reliability over gross scale. By 2024, he was not the largest operator in his township, and he no longer wanted that title. He was current, stable, and home for supper more nights than during his expansion decade. His children saw less stress at the table. The county still remembered the auction where he lost ground. His family remembered the year he stopped bleeding and started recovering. Nora's resolution looked like continuity, which is the outcome she had valued all along. The revised structure gave her manageable, annual obligations, and 2 decent hay seasons restored confidence enough to schedule deferred maintenance she had postponed for years. She replaced failing barn electrical, repaired 2 pasture fences, and finally saw a dentist after delaying care through stress years. None of those actions show up in net worth conversations, yet each one marks a household leaving survival mode. Her homestead stayed hers. Her herd size became right-sized for risk. Pride remained intact because the help had been structured as a fair note, documented, enforceable, and respectful, and her silence never had to be broken in public to keep what mattered. Martha's role became more visible once people started asking how the Sutton balance sheet had stayed coherent across decades. Bo had made discipline public through what he drove and what he refused to finance. Martha had made discipline durable through reconciliation habits few people ever saw: monthly closeouts, quarterly stress checks, tax reserve segregation, and annual family reviews where assumptions were challenged before markets could challenge them. She administered the Family Assistance Fund that grew alongside the scholarship, small targeted interventions for neighbors facing temporary shocks, veterinary emergency bills, short-term feed gaps, bridge loans with terms clear from day one. She accepted no anonymous hero stories and no performative gratitude rituals. She wanted receipts and outcomes. Lena Sutton represented the generational handoff and the widening of the philosophy beyond one farm. As a first-generation agricultural finance student, she entered classrooms where debt was taught as tool, risk as model, and liquidity as ratio. At home, she had seen those abstractions translated into weather delays and sleepless nights and relief when bills were covered without begging for extensions. Her scholarship did not demand that she return to farm management. It required that she understand rural credit deeply enough to avoid repeating preventable harm in whatever role she chose: lender, analyst, advisor, or operator. In internship reports, she wrote that collateral appraisals can hide fragility when income variance is undermodeled, language that sounded academic and felt personal. The Oliver remained behind the barn through all of this, a dead machine in mechanical terms and an active symbol in local memory. Children climbing it for photos did not know hydraulics failed in spring of 2009. Older farmers did know, and they saw something else in that rust. They saw an object bought in 1991 for $4,800 cash, worked 18 seasons, retired when repair math failed, and left in place while financed, fleets cycled through notes and refinances. Bo had kept it there on purpose as visual proof of the horizon he chose: own what works, retire what does not, and refuse a payment clock you cannot control. The tractor became a timeline marker no one had planned, proof that material age can coexist with financial strength when ownership choices are intentional. Appearance kept misleading people, because appearance often rewards urgency, while wealth rewards patience. By the time county filings were reviewed in late 2024, the phrase "every loan in the county" had already spread through coffee shops, simplified and exaggerated in casual retelling. The precise version mattered, so Martha corrected it when asked. The reference was the 2009 and 2010 operating note cohort, documented in county records not every note ever written in every era. Precision protected credibility. The broader point survived precision easily. Debt structures are temporary agreements that expire, reset, or fail. Ownership and liquidity, if maintained, create options that survive cycles. The county had watched both truths play out on familiar roads with familiar families. No case study required. Bo's own balance sheet at the end of the story looked strong and boring at once, exactly how he preferred it. 450 owned acres, debt-free. No consumer debt. Core machinery mostly used and maintained. Liquidity rebuilt after the auction through conservative operating surpluses. Assistance commitments structured with legal clarity. Scholarship capital ring-fenced. His truck still carried the same odometer story from auction week. 312,000 miles in 2022, more now, still running. If someone asked whether he planned to replace it, he answered with mileage and maintenance history, never status. People eventually stopped expecting a different answer because the existing one kept proving adequate. The emotional center of the town's memory settled around one scene, the courthouse hallway, at 3:28 in the afternoon, when the title receipt went up and assumptions came down. Vindication arrived without speech. No one pinned anyone. No lecture interrupted the day. Arithmetic did the talking that people had resisted hearing in quieter years. The same dynamic repeated in smaller rooms afterward, at bank desks, kitchen tables, equipment lots, and fence lines where neighbors asked each other harder questions than they used to ask. What can this operation survive if next year goes wrong? How much of this payment schedule depends on perfect timing? Which asset actually produces resilience and which one only signals success while times are easy? Every named life in this story reached a concrete endpoint. Bo Sutton remained on the farm, debt-free on 450 owned acres, still disinterested in performative spending. Martha Sutton continued as bookkeeper and administrator of the Family Assistance Fund, turning generosity into systems rather than moments. Cal Dean kept selling equipment and updated his posture after public correction. At auction, showed him where appearance had misled him. Trent Holloway processed Bo's wire in full and revised lending posture toward stronger liquidity standards. Eli Warren lost owned ground during the stress cycle and later cash rented 120 acres from Bo under terms that allowed recovery. Nora Pike kept her homestead through a discreet, structured note path with legal recording and manageable obligations. Lena Sutton advanced through agricultural finance studies supported by the $180,000 scholarship endowment. The county still drives past the Sutton place and sees what outsiders would probably misread: old paint, repaired sheds, practical fences, one rusted Oliver behind the barn. People who know the record see a different picture layered underneath, an operation that treated debt as weather risk, treated cash as strategic oxygen, and treated ownership as a long game measured in decades rather than seasons. The paradox never really changed. The man who looked least financed had the most freedom to act when everyone else needed permission. In agriculture, that freedom can decide who survives the hard years and who helps others survive with them. Late one evening in a harvest week, Lena stood by the Oliver with a notebook from school and asked her grandfather why he kept a machine that did not run. He looked at the rust, looked at the barn roofline, and gave the same kind of answer he had given his whole life: short, practical, enough to do the job. He said it still tells time. She wrote that down, maybe for class, maybe for herself. In that county, the sentence made immediate sense. A dead tractor had outlasted an entire lending cohort because one family decided years earlier that independence compounds quietly, and quiet compounding eventually becomes visible even to people who were never looking for it.